So before we begin, I just want to invite participants to copy or download the slide deck and for later reference, or if you want to write notes as we go along. I'll drop a link to it in the chat. And I'll just note that this slide deck is licensed under Creative Commons. This means you are free to copy, distribute, remix, build upon, and otherwise transform this work without seeking my permission, as long as you credit my original work and indicate the nature of the transformative use. So for example, adapted in part from or paraphrase from. And also you should apply the same CC BY 4.0 license to the new work. In attribution, I don't mind if you identify me as a queer scientist of color. So before we begin with the content of my presentation, I want to say that I derive my livelihood from my employment with Kenyon College. So I want you to know that the college exists because it was built on the ancestral homelands of Indigenous peoples. So I appreciate your solemn attention to this acknowledgement. The disputed Treaty of Greenville in 1795 created a legal framework for US settlers to forcibly remove and harass Indigenous peoples from the region that we now call Ohio. At the time, this included people identified as Miamia, Lenape, Wyandot, and Shawnee. That event cleared the way for Kenyon and other Ohio colleges to settle on this land throughout the 19th century. In addition, though Kenyon was founded in 1824, Black students did not enroll here until 1949, and female students could not enroll here until 1969. This is a legacy that I'm attempting to confront through material compensation and outreach to local Indigenous communities and through critical evaluation of my work. This is an ongoing learning process, and I welcome with humility your feedback on my efforts and on the colleges. By the way, this map shows the area covered by the Treaty of Greenville. We're located right around here. You can find maps like this at the nonprofit organization Native Land Digital, which is run by a majority Indigenous board in Canada. A few other things to establish relationally with you as an audience. I am a stutterer. I was trained to mask this by pausing, so please excuse any moments when I stutter or seem to pause for no reason. I know it can be distracting, and I appreciate your patience. Also, I do try to speak in a Midwestern English dialect, but I know my pronunciation of some words might not be recognizable. So please do interrupt to clarify if needed. You can click the reactions button in the Zoom interface and then raise hand to get my attention. I will not be offended because I value clarity of communication and I appreciate your patience. In my slides, I will use different colors primarily to create visual contrast, but not to indicate any specific meaning. Anytime I want to attach meaning to visual attributes, I will provide that information verbally as well. So please let me know if I forget to do that at some point. By the way, if you are just joining us, I just want to let you know that you can feel free to copy this document. Here's a link again in the chat. So let me begin by explaining what a prospectus is. So in my classes, it's a document that a student writes, which organizes a set of narrative statements about their values, abilities, and in some cases, aspirations. So here's an example. This student identifies personal integrity as one of their core values. But that's just two words, a phrase, and on its own is pretty meaningless. So in the prospectus, they go a little further and define what that value means to them, usually in the form of a falsifiable claim about themselves. So in this example, the student says, I recognize when I make mistakes and I own up to them in a timely manner. So a specific claim about how they show personal integrity. This is not the only way to define those two words. It's just their way of doing it. Finally, they present evidence for that value. These are anecdotes about situations that tested the claim and behavior that supports the claim. So in one example, the student describes making a mistake in the lab their fear of reporting the error and the resulting consequences. They back this up with another example where they admit to displaying gender bias in their work with a teammate and then describe their efforts to remedy that error. This is all adapted with permission from student work. All right, so there's three sort of components to each part of the prospectus: a value, a claim about that value, and then some evidence to back it up. So that's the end product. I'm sure that what you and a student would want to know is, how do you get there? How do you make this document? So I start with a type of exercise called values affirmation. I've seen it in a variety of forms and contexts, but I'm most familiar with examples presented by Cloud Steele in Whistling Vivaldi and Sia Verschelden in her book, Bandwidth Recovery. So in most versions of values affirmation, the student gets a sort of menu of words that describe personal values, and they simply choose a few of them. They reflect on the meaning of these values and then write about them in some way. So that's the basic outline of values affirmation. Social psychologists have studied and debated the merits of values affirmation. Personally, I just use it because it is pretty simple and it elicits divergent generative thinking about themselves, which is my goal. Afterward, I switch to a more convergent phase. So students organize their thoughts and attempt to synthesize them into an informative one-sentence claim. This claim is rarely ever perfect or final. Its main function is to motivate the gathering of evidence that will support the claim. So at the beginning of the semester, this sequence of assignments essentially builds a tentative outline of the prospectus. And then we just iteratively go back and fill it in and update it throughout the semester. So let's dig into the details. Here's a list I present to students. To get a feel for this, look through it and pick a few that fit how you think of yourself. If there are other terms not on the list, feel free to add them as well. I'll stop talking now for 20 seconds so that you can just try that out. Just find 5 values that fit who you are, who you aspire to be. All right, so that's the student's first task, their first exposure to this assignment. There are much more expansive lists available. Sia Verschelden has an entire page of them. I use this particular list for specific reasons, which I'm happy to discuss later. So after you have some values, the next step is to clarify what they mean. I tell students explicitly that statements about your values should help inform other people what behavior and actions to expect from you. So I think most students can take it from there, but occasionally you find someone who's a little stumped by this task. So I offer a few prompts, which you see in the round boxes. So this yellow one here just says, recall a situation where this value guided your actions. So it's just recalling back in the past. Another prompt that some students find helpful is imagine how things would be different without this value. So what cause and effect relationship does this value have on your behavior and outcomes in your life? And then for some students, it's just simply to fill out this the usual journalist rubric: who, what, when, where, how, and why about that value. However they do it, at the end, the students try to summarize these thoughts into a 1 or 2 sentence claim for each value. So looking back on the example earlier about personal integrity, notice that this statement is not an abstract discussion on the nature of integrity. It tells us what this person will do in certain types of situations. And that's the example that I try to move students toward. Once you have a claim, you can use it as a sort of interpretive lens on your life experiences. So think of it as gathering evidence from your life story. In this example, the student's claim is about mistakes, which prompted them to think back about their values, about their mistakes, and to find a simple one that they thought was meaningful. What was an embarrassing incident that they preferred to forget became a way to illustrate a core value of their identity. In recent years, I found that many students write claims that they struggle to connect to their lives. So in these cases, it's often because their claims are vague or full of buzzwords. So I developed some instruction to show students what types of writing can obscure the meaning of their values and then advise them how to revise their claims. So here is like one sort of really quick instruction that I provide to a student. I tell them that I often see passive phrases like, I'm able to write clearly, or I make sure my papers are free of typos. So this is kind of skipping ahead to the outcomes. It doesn't reveal the behavior that leads to those outcomes. There are lots of ways to write clearly. You can outline, you can brainstorm, you can do research. You can have someone else write for you, or these days, something else write for you. So I tell students that these types of statements are not very informative. I see them in cover letters all the time, and they are basically noise to me. So instead, I ask them, what strategies do you use to write clearly? So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the exercise I usually do to illustrate this, but it's simply to ask people to think of a strategy, a writing strategy, and share them with other people. This is what I would do with students. But instead, I'll just show you another common problem, is when a student's claim simply says what they are. So for example, I get this a lot. I'm a team player, or I am a natural leader. So when students write this, I know what they're trying to get at. But again, the language is not informative. It invites essentialism and stereotyping instead of reflection on your life story or a nuanced understanding of your values. I don't fault the students. No doubt, this is how people talked about them in high school, the kind of rhetoric they find in their media environments. So I don't shame them for using this language. Rather, I use it as a starting point for critical thinking. So I might ask them, what behavior distinguishes a team player, or a natural leader, or a problem solver, or a good writer? And the cool thing is I get diverse answers. For some people, leadership is about persuasion and influence, but for others, the same word is actually about awareness of other people's emotional states. So the word itself actually doesn't matter. It's the behavior that does. I do have other examples, which are linked to in the materials attached to this document. The final stage is for a student to gather evidence for their claim. I used to ask students to take a moment from their life story, but often students find this pretty intimidating and amorphous, especially if they were not socialized to talk about themselves, which I think is a lot these days. So I've developed, I adapted a way to scaffold the construction of a professional anecdote. This is actually with the help of Leslie Harding, who was formerly at the Kenyon Career Development Office. I'm grateful for her and for her help in crafting lessons based on this structure. It's called CAR, Context, Action, Result. And it provides a neat way for a student to kind of scaffold their anecdote. So they kind of think about what the context is and fill that in with details. Then they try to think about what was their response to that situation. And this is often the hardest part. What was the actual result from that? Sorry, can people still hear me? If someone could just wave.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Sorry, my earpiece like suddenly told me that it was disconnected. Okay. So where was I? Yes. So let's take a look at applying this rubric to this example here. I'll give students this example, and I will ask them to just simply outline or underline or just color in which parts are context, action, and result. So what they find often is that this area here, which says, when I was once working in the lab at night, that sets the stage. That's the context. The action often is simply one sentence. It might be longer, might be 1 or 2 sentences, but often it's just like a sort of decision point. So in this case, the student says, I decided to ask my research advisor what to do about the mistake. Student then follows with the result, had to toss out a result, a sample, but that action avoided invalidating an experiment. So that student actually connects their action with an outcome, which is something that I often want to see when I'm trying to evaluate whether I want to hire someone. So this brings us back to the question of feedback. So this is, a final result. Students are often not there on their first try. So how do I integrate this into the rest of my class? The prospectus is unique to each student. So the assessment has to be individualized. So the various elements of the course is designed to support prospectus building. The first is the syllabus annotation at the beginning of the course. I credit Orchid Tierney for introducing me to this idea and suggesting the name syllabus annotation. This is a full hour in-depth annotation of the syllabus, relating the prospectus to learning goals. So students naturally want to know, what is the prospectus? What's a good one? How does it factor into their grade? How do they do it well? I also incorporate reflection prompts like minute papers in lessons. So they look back and say, did I show examples of succeeding on that I can put into my syllabus? I have a required scheduled office hour visit at the beginning of the course, just to discuss their initial draft of the prospectus and give them feedback on their claims. And then finally, I have devised generalized assessment criteria, which can apply to each student individually. So I'll show you an example of what those kinds of criteria look like. So this is the rubric that I apply to the prospectus at the end of the semester. It's pretty generalized. It doesn't really matter what field the student is in, what kind of claims they made. It just says you need to have 3 strong claims. They've been instructed on what a good, strong claim is, and I give them feedback 3 times throughout the semester to help them revise that claim. So I'll let you look at this at your leisure afterward. In each case, I show the criterion, but also an example of the kind of feedback I would give about that criterion. I just want to note that this, in my view, this assignment supports culturally responsive teaching because it offers differentiated assessment, and it mitigates disparities in pre-college experience because it's a portion of the grade that doesn't depend that much on the student's existing content knowledge in general chemistry. It signals affirmation of diverse values by an authority figure. This is a known effect documented by social psychologists. And it promotes agency and metacognition in the learning process because they build self-efficacy on their own terms and their own values. I find it useful in building relationship with my students. I learn a lot about their background and their aspirations, their anxieties, things that they are worried about coming into college, coming into chemistry. And it also helps to signal a culture of compassion and care within a STEM field where that's typically not valued as much. In my view, the biggest benefit is that they essentially self-document their experience in the class, which comes in really handy when they ask for recommendations from me or from anyone else, really. So I just want to throw out some questions to you. I've documented here my assessment of how much time this takes, because I want to acknowledge that in a large class, this might not be sustainable. We're looking at a total of 90 minutes of class time for all students, but the office hour time that you spend on a student can grow pretty quickly. So we're looking at, for a class of 20, 10 hours in the first 2 weeks, 10 hours throughout the semester, and then 10 hours during finals as they frantically revise their prospectus. So a total of 30 hours of out-of-class time spent just on this one assignment. Again, I invite you to copy, reuse this slide deck. Also, in the slide deck are links to my lesson plans. So if you want to see like what it looks like in my class, how do I instruct the students to build a prospectus, as well as a template document that students can use to organize their claims and anecdotes. So let me stop here by just throwing up some questions that I have for you, but of course, I'm willing to take questions that you might have for me. Thank you.
So in terms of sustainability, Simon, I'm wondering if this is a place where it would be useful or too risky to involve some structured peer feedback instead of carrying all of the feedback on your own. Obviously, I mean, you talked about that. You talked about one of the benefits being affirmations from an authority figure, which a peer is not going to give. But I'm just that was the question that I had just looking at the 30 hours of grading. Could any of that be moved to other people?
Yeah, so when you use the word risk, and so I would say yes, that could be risky in a first year class where students have may have pretty unsophisticated ideas about how to value other people's values, or how to value other people, period. So I do have a few, like in the class lesson itself, I do give students a chance to share with each other their values and their claims, and maybe help each other build their claims. So there's a little bit of that, but I would not, for a first year class, I would not shift a lot of it into structured peer feedback. I do that more with upper level classes. So I do use this in upper level chemistry courses. Thanks.
Hi, Simon. I'm wondering, now that you say you use it in both intro and upper level, do students find themselves picking different values, or how do they not just repeat what they've done from previous iterations?
Thanks. It sounds like Aaron. I can't see.
It's Aaron with the dishwasher in the background. Sorry.
Oh no, I can't hear the dishwasher. So your sound, your noise removal is working well. Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, that's great. I actually kind of wish students would remember what they did as a first year, my majors. They often don't. I think I've only had one student ever say, hey, can I just reuse mine? I tell them no. And that's because one of the criteria, so I'll just kind of go back to that. One of the criteria is that the anecdote must come, or at least 6 of them, must come from work done in the course. So they can choose the same values if they want, but they need to create new anecdotes. Now, I think part of your question was, what kind of values do they choose? I have noticed a sort of correlation in the upper level courses. They do tend to choose more, I guess I would call them social and emotional types of values, things like leadership and teamwork. Whereas students at the first year level, they tend to choose things like knowledge and writing well, so things that are kind of just a little bit more skill-based rather than relational. That's the only difference that I've noticed between lower first year and upper year students. I think we should probably wrap up questions.
Probably, yeah.
Read on to Megan's. But I appreciate any questions off channel. My email address is on the slide.